Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you. Hello and welcome to Belaboring the Point. I'm your host, Kate Riga. Today I'm lucky enough to be joined by my pal and former colleague, HuffPost's Matt Shuham. Matt started as a news writer at TPM way back in 2016 and subsequently became a reporter covering extremism, voting rights, and the federal government. In 2022, he joined the HuffPost National Desk, where he has covered domestic politics and misinformation, including stories on vaccines, election denial, the US-Mexico border, and the media. He also just started a personal newsletter, Gathering String, which can be found on Substack. I've read the first entry. It's very good. Matt, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Kate, and thanks for those kind words. It means a lot.
Yeah, well, it's nice to see you, an old member of the gang. So
Yeah,
today we're going to be talking about what you've reported on a lot, Matt, which is kind of, what's going on the Gaza Strip and how that's refracting domestically and politically. And the obvious place to start here are these college campus protests, which have cropped up in all kinds of schools, kind of really across the country, and are being addressed by these permutations of college administrators, elected officials, and police very differently campus to campus. You recently kind of popped by Columbia's, which has been a focal point, I think, in media coverage and kind of discussion of the campuses. So, just foundationally, why do you think that these campus protests matter? Like what's going on here?
yeah. I think in general, it's always been the case that students are sort of unencumbered with a lot of the baggage of generations older than them when it comes to sort of the norms of politics or what the status quo is or what has political inertia. Um, and I think this is one of those issues where the U.S. relationship with Israel has been such a steady part of American politics, even though it's gone through a whole bunch of iterations. It's just like the UK. It's one of those things that's sort of a core part of American foreign policy. Um, and I think after October 7th, when that horrific attack happened, when college students saw Israel's response and when the death toll started to rise in Gaza, they had a fresh pair of eyes to see what was happening. And I think, as with a lot of college campus protests through the decades and centuries, they're probably in a position to see this in a new light. And so I think that's what we've seen. And there are lots of different iterations of what college campus protests have looked like across the country. Um, but I do think there's definitely a generational divide when it comes to American politics with regard to what people think the U.S. relationship with Israel ought to be, and in particular, in this case, what people think the U.S. reaction to Israel's military operation should be.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And there's a valence of here, which is how the protests are being covered. And this is the kind of thing where I get instinctively wary about when especially things kind of happening at quote unquote elite colleges kind of become, wall to wall kind of big headline news. I think in part because big outlets are just kind of traditionally terrible at it. Like there's the whole cottage industry, especially at the Atlantic, of covering, what used to be the big free speech issue on campus, which was, protesting like right wing speakers or, canceling people who are going to come and talk at commencement, things like that. And I mean, I'm interested to hear what you think about this, but I think there's this dynamic where college kids kind of slot in as the quote unquote extremists on the left to counterbalance extremists on the right who traditionally are in positions of exponentially more power, like you'll have what a Republican US senator is saying versus like a sophomore at Barnard. So when the conversation here comes about protest tactics and individual protesters and maybe signs that go further than, what like the bulk of people out there are talking about, I just get a little nervous. But like, where do you stand on the coverage and particularly the mainstream media treatment of the protests so far?
Yeah, I mean, it, it's interesting because I've covered these college protests and I've covered Ivy League campuses. And full disclosure, I went to Harvard. I'm a product of this system.
Brag.
I think like part of it is in the past couple decades, the media has become professionalized in a way that it's become a white collar profession. People with Ivy League degrees want to become reporters and media analysts the same way that they want to become doctors and lawyers. And also it became a little bit cost prohibitive given the low salaries of incoming reporters that people who were blue collar or working class had a harder time becoming members of the media. What that means now is when we see campus protests at elite colleges, what the people reporting on it see is themselves.
Hmm.
They see the next generation of reporters and politicians and policymakers, and I think that can that sort of can prompt a visceral reaction in folks who think, well, okay, it's one thing for Palestinians to protest Israeli military operations, certainly, or it may be, generally people in the Democratic Party or even people at, state schools or public colleges. But then you see students at Columbia doing it, and it really, let's say for a writer at The Atlantic, it's a way of confronting sort of an elite class of media workers with their peers, even if they're a generation or two removed. And so I think when people in the media see Ivy League protests or people at Berkeley or UCLA or wherever it is, it prompts. There's a certain level of uh, undeniability about it. That some of the sentiments, some of these anti-war protests are cross-class um, and more, I think, more common than people may have wanted to acknowledge, especially given, like I said, the ubiquity of sort of pro-Israel sentiment throughout past couple of decades of American history. So that's one part of it. And yes, the other part of it is it's very easy to go to the streets outside Columbia or to go to the vicinity of any campus and find an anti Semite and point your camera at him and say, look at what these college protests are bringing to the fore. Right. So it's, it's very easy to sort of caricature them or to become alarmist at bigotry, because this is, in our case, this is New York City up here, and there are bigots and crazy people all over the place. On the other hand, I think there is a dynamic where elite colleges are sort of a way of confronting the sort of American intellectual class with a debate that they haven't been willing to have. And so it's a way of forcing this question, you know, is this a military policy, a military campaign that the United States should be supporting? And it's a hard question to answer, I think, for a lot of people. And I'm not saying that flippantly. I think it really is a question that American politics hasn't had to deal with because opposition has not been as widespread as it is now to Israeli policy.
Definitely. So last thing on the campus protest specifically, we've seen varying levels of police violence, police aggression, including some well publicized episodes of brutality against a professor at Emory. Last night there are videos of police shooting rubber bullets at kids at UCLA at the encampment there. And this hasn't been true across the board. I thought notably MPD here in DC declined GW's request to clear their encampment. So it is a little bit place by place. But, then you have NYPD putting out this like triumphant film reel of its raid at Columbia. You have Greg Abbott calling in the National Guard at UT Austin. So what do you make of the violent crackdowns, of police kind of donning riot gear and wielding, like sonar cannons to break up these protests and arrest some of the students and professors participating?
Yeah, and I think it's such a valuable point to bring up, as you just did, like the range of police responses. Yeah, in some places, and college administrator responses. In some places, college administrators have said, okay, well, you can set up an encampment, but you can't block a sidewalk, right? Um, and in other places, I think it was Dartmouth yesterday, it had just gotten going, and they called in the police, and the violent arrests began pretty much immediately. Um, Gosh, what to say about this? I mean, when I visited Columbia a few days ago, it was a circus. I tried one day, I wasn't allowed in because I hadn't been on some media list. I bugged all the spokespeople. They stonewalled me. They said, come back tomorrow between 2 and 4. I came back tomorrow between 2 and 4. They had a press pass. They were sort of, it was like, I mean, it was like getting into Coachella or something. There was these barricades, people, scanning IDs. And Columbia is a part of New York City. It's traditionally an open campus. And then to get in there and to see this encampment, it was like the size of a Little League infield. It was not very big, and it was not encumbering campus in any way. I mean, maybe if they were chanting at full volume or something, and you were a student who was trying to sleep right next door, but I really didn't see that kind of thing happening. And what happened next was the administration says, well, we can't have this. So if you're still at this encampment, 2 p.m. tomorrow or whatever, you're going to be suspended. At that point, the students escalated. They occupied a building. They put bike locks around the doors and piled furniture up so it would be harder to get them out. And they escalated civil disobedience, I would say. I saw some body camera footage of, just to use this example, of NYPD breaching Hamilton Hall there at Columbia. And I did not see any students fighting back. They were all sitting on the floor, arms linked. What that tells me is, yes, it was a really intense police response prompted by a really unusual request by the college administration to bring in police in the first place. And the entire time, as far as I can tell, Columbia students participating in this protest were completely nonviolent. And like I said, there are some crazy people in New York City outside the campus walls that probably it certainly said some anti-Semitic things, maybe pushed some people over Israeli flags they were holding. But in this specific instance, it was a violent police response to a nonviolent protest. That's not to say that's always the case. There was a Cal Poly in California where the students occupied a building, and in this case, when police tried to enter and remove them, they were very explicit that they had a violent response. They, used a water jug to hit a cop over the head and threw a chair at them, and not severe violence. No one's shooting anybody, but like there are levels of protest. What I've seen from the majority of college campuses is nonviolent protest, people perhaps engaged in sit-ins or encampments, and college administrators are really the ones deciding how violent this is going to get. I think the media coverage has not been good about this. I'm not sure if you saw Dana Bash, CNN, had a monologue where she talked all about the violence of these protests, and meanwhile she was playing clips of the police attacking protesters or pro-Israel counter-demonstrators attacking protesters at UCLA. So I think the coverage has failed in a lot of cases. Same thing with talking about sort of quote-unquote outside agitators or quote-unquote industrial chains that are really just bike locks. There's a lot of really sloppy coverage of this, and I think it does a disservice to what has been mostly a peaceful protest movement. But that's something I think that news consumers just have to be wary of. Like, it is a goal of civil disobedience to get your story in front of the public, to get your issue debated. And I think students engaged in these protests have succeeded in that. I think the media and certainly politicians have failed at times to accurately portray what's happening on these campuses.
There is a piece of this that's divorced from the content, but just kind of strikes me from a strictly PR optics standpoint, which is that you have some of these college administrations, like Wesleyan is one of them that comes to mind, where the administration has been taking this note of, like, while things are peaceful, we are fine with people exercising, their free speech, and if they break school rules, that's kind of an intra-school thing to deal with. Like, you don't really
Mhm.
call in police to kind of to straighten that out. And that goes for police too, which I initially moved here, right before the George Floyd protests, which were a huge thing in the city. And it was kind of striking the degree to which MPD was just de-escalating all the time, like, and I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm not saying that these protests didn't have any incidents, but by and large, it was, you could tell that they had come out with this plan to, kind of wear normal police stuff, like not put on the riot gear and swing batons at people, and just kind of like make a perimeter that's far enough away that it doesn't really agitate people. And then you could tell, a swings in emotion when that changed, like if they moved in to start clearing people, or brought in reinforcements, you could feel the crowds kind of get agitated. Like there's clear, I think, tactics and like psychology here, where you can walk a line that doesn't make things worse. And it's striking to see certain administrations and police forces just kind of go in like guns blazing. I mean, some of the optics were just, it's scary, especially when these police forces are increasingly militarized all the time. I mean, it kind of looks like an army going in after this, like, whatever 100 kids who are sitting in this Columbia school building. I mean, it's quite a split screen.
Yeah, and like you said, using rubber bullets at UCLA, flashbangs at Columbia, these LRAD, these super amplified speakers that hurt people's ears, pepper spray. Certainly, the police becoming more militarized have made these police confrontations with protesters. And I think it makes it that much easier for the police to become violent, even though
Mhm.
that's not really the way it's framed often. And I do think also um, it has changed the way that protests operate. I mean, people are covering their faces more often because they see the consequences, of getting caught up in sort of like a doxing cycle, for example. So yes, I think like these well, I want to say, like, on the one hand I want to say these aren't the protests of the 60s. On the other hand, there were a bunch of bombings in the 60s. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't want to think, I don't want to say that this is unprecedented. I mean, I think in a lot of ways the current era of American protest is more peaceful than it has been in the past. um, but yeah, I think it also goes to how, again, how these protests are being depicted in the media and characterized by people in authority. The president of Columbia wrote in her letter to the police requesting that they come in the other night that, people outside the university had come in and were leading this occupation of Hamilton Hall, and police in turn used that as justification for the level of force that they brought to clear that building. um, First of all, whether or not quote unquote outsiders are involved in a protest really shouldn't have any bearing on the level of force being brought to clear a building, especially if there hasn't been any history of violence. Um, but second of all, like, um, it seems like there's sort of a rhetorical buildup, and that ends up justifying a lot of these sort of like heightened approaches that I think police are taking to these protests.
Yeah. So to get into the politics of this is obviously, to Republicans pretty evident delight, a wedge issue for Democrats, the way that it just isn't for Republicans. Joe Biden gave brief remarks earlier today where he pushed both kind of the freedom to assemble and the rule of law. This idea of kind of you can speak your truth if you don't break things, kind of middle line. How would you kind of characterize his approach so far to the protest? And do you think that is there a way that he can move on this issue that assuages the protesters and, those who are aligned with them?
Well, so I think to start, like whenever I've spoken to, and it's been several stories at this point, talking to protesters on college campuses, whenever I speak to them, they end the interview the same way, which is keep the focus on Gaza. These do not strike me as self-indulgent protesters. They don't strike me the way they strike a lot of pundits as people who are, looking to make friends or like hook up with people. There's been this weird obsession with like people protesting for the wrong reason. You know what I mean? That it's some
Mhm,
social
mhm.
thing. Over and over when I talk to protesters, and I think they've been successful in keeping the debate about Gaza and American support for Israeli military policy. So, is there something that Biden can do to assuage these protesters? Yes. I think they would say stop sending arms to Israel, put down a firm red line with regard to the invasion of Rafah, um, um, independent international investigation of alleged war crimes. And if I think if you were to ask them, they would say that's what they would say, that it's not about the approach to the campus protest, it's about the approach to the Israeli government. Um, with regard to what Biden just said, I have a few quotes here. It seems like, and like you said, it seems like he's sort of trying to kind of go down the middle. He said vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campus, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduation. None of this is a peaceful protest. Which, just as a footnote, some of that is peaceful protest. I mean, you know, forcing the cancellation of graduation. There's a lot of ways to do that peacefully. And in fact, if just use Columbia again because it's just the thing I'm most familiar with, and it's the first one of these campus sit-ins. One of the unsaid, uncomfortable details of that encampment was all of the rented chairs for the Columbia graduation were sitting in stacks right next to the encampment, ready to be unfolded and ready for the graduation. And if that encampment had continued on in that location, they would have peacefully disrupted Columbia's graduation, right? So I think we need to be honest about the difference between violent protest and peaceful protest. And disrupting a graduation can be and would have been a peaceful protest in this case. Now, breaking windows on a building, well, it's not hurting anybody. It's property damage, so that maybe that's violent. But I think it wasn't an altogether honest characterization to say that these and even though he did not say all of these protesters are violent, I think there is a blurring of the lines between peaceful and violent protests in Biden's remarks that sort of reflects that blurring of the lines on the college level, or college administrator, and on the sort of pundit level. Whether Biden can sort of navigate this, I think ultimately these campuses will be cleared out the way that we saw at UCLA and Columbia, or in some cases, like you mentioned, administrators will find some way that they can allow these protests to proceed without bringing in the police. I think the fundamental tension is what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and that is not going anywhere unless there is some ceasefire deal, some exchange of hostages. And so, yeah, I don't think there's been. I think maybe at Northwestern, I think there was some resolution, or at Brown, there was maybe a resolution that involved something besides the protesters' demands for divestment from the Israeli government. But I think overall, these protesters are concerned with what's happening in Israel and the Palestinian territories. So, unless the administration's policy changes toward that, or unless for some reason the war were to stop, then I don't think there's some way you can get around this before the election.
Yeah. What degree of leverage do you think Biden has over Netanyahu and kind of making him change his behavior?
I mean, we have money and we have weapons, right? And those are the
Yeah.
things you need to fight a war. And we're giving them to Israel, and that's the start and the end of it, I think.
Mhm.
And if we were to stop that, then eventually the war would stop. And that's not to say, to be clear, that Hamas would stop attacking Israel. But that's also not to say that Hamas would succeed in eradicating Israel, or you know what I mean. Uh, Through its history, and especially since the creation of the Iron Dome, Israel has been fairly successful at protecting itself from Palestinian militants. Right, October 7th was obviously the greatest failure in that regard in the country's history, and I think it's why so many Israelis are fed up with the Netanyahu government, right? Um, so yes, I do think obviously, like if they did not, they have weapons manufacturing capabilities of their own, and I think the war would continue even if for some reason Biden were to stop supplying them. It doesn't seem like he has any appetite for that, and I think domestic political concerns would most likely preclude him from really putting his foot down. But I mean, I spoke to members of the College Democrats of America yesterday, and they released a statement that I was surprised by, basically siding with campus protesters, saying Joe Biden was backing a genocidal far right Israeli regime, their words. And Hassan Piarali, who's the chair of the Muslim caucus for the College Democrats of America, he told me, quote, Biden has decided to hitch his wagon to what is a far right extremist radical government. We are letting him know this is on you now. And I thought that was such a fascinating way to look at it because this is a college of Democrats. I mean, it's not a giant organization, but these are young people who are um, excited about politics, but they're also young people who are excited about the Democratic Party, which is so bizarre, right? I mean, you know, there are a lot of them, but like, you know, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, a lot of folks are who are passionate about this issue are to the left of that, right? Who don't consider themselves Democrats, but you know, maybe socialists or whatever. But for mainstream young Democrats to come out and say, "Listen, this has got to stop, or else we risk losing this election," that may make an impact with the Biden administration, and in turn, that may change the course of this war. But I saw Seymour Hersh talk one time, and he said the two worst words for a reporter are "I think." So this gets into predicting the future, and I can't, you know, you can't do that.
So let's talk a little bit about the Republican position here, though it's gone a little under the radar. Trump, in particular, kind of cast himself as staunchly pro Israel. And then he got a little pissy with Netanyahu after he congratulated Biden in 2020. And in kind of typical Trump fashion, has seemed to drag that spleen along with him. Lately, he's kind of donned this pundit hat and is saying he thinks Israel is, losing the PR war. He's blamed Netanyahu for not averting the October 7th attack. I mean, what do you make of that kind of jockeying of where he's positioning himself in this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to they are happy. I think you mentioned this earlier. They're happy to let this be Joe Biden's problem.
Mhm.
And by that, I mean the main contention that people who are upset with this war have is the action of the Israeli government and Biden's support for that action, right? So when it comes to sort of anti Semitism on campus or Benjamin Netanyahu's position within Israeli politics, people are happy to opine on that. And that means they don't have to talk about the Israeli military policy. And so I think Trump is certainly happy to just stay in that lane. Like, this is Joe Biden's war to negotiate with Netanyahu. I'm going to be over here heckling him, talking about politics. It's like, you know, punditry is the way that reporters talk about politics without sharing their true opinions, right? I think
Mhm.
this is what Donald Trump is doing, and he's always sort of done that when there are issues that he's vulnerable on that he'd rather not talk about. You can talk about the politics of it, or the punditry, or the theater of it. And I think a lot of Republicans are doing that more broadly. Like, if you corner them on it, they'll say, oh, they will commit to supporting the Israeli government, and some are more open about that than others, but certainly more than the Democratic Party. But I think they're eager to talk about something else because that is more, like you said, of a split within the Democratic Party that they can take advantage of. There was a quote from Tom Cotton. Hold on. Oh, yeah, he referred to the nascent pogroms at Columbia, which, this idea of Jewish students just being massacred or, pushed from polite society, which is just simply not true. But it's a way of redirecting the conversation to something that's more damaging along partisan lines, and I think that's what Trump is trying to do. If reporters were to really corner him and say, "What do you think Israeli military policy should be? What do you think the American policy toward Israel should be?" I think that would be helpful for voters. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of people who are hesitant to support Biden might see that he is fully on board with an even more aggressive military policy than even Biden is. But I think he's happy to stay out of that lane as long as he can.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that and how there might come a time where he's not kind of able to do his little like narration from on high thing about this, as we get into, well, if there are presidential debates, I guess we'll see. But as it becomes more, what are the competing visions for the country, even though I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
say that that also sounds like a naive hope from another era, like will we even get that kind of one-on-one comparison here?
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine like what would Trump's debate line about this war be, and I just picture him like trashing Biden and saying,
Mhm.
Jews that don't support Israel are bad Jews or whatever he says about like
Right.
it just anything except the actual policy, I think is what he would end up talking about. I don't think anyone would be willing to put in the effort or the time necessary to really get him on the record. I hope I'm wrong in that regard, but it just seems like he's not eager to talk about it.
Right. So something that you alluded to is that, Israel has long been threatening to invade Rafah. This is something that Biden at one time called, a quote unquote red line for his administration. If there's not a plan to keep civilians safe, a Pentagon spokesperson recently said Israel has assured them that the invasion wouldn't happen without US input, which I thought was like kind of a hilarious way to put that. Kind of like, here's our Friday night plans, let me know what you guys think. So
Right.
is it your sense? I mean, and again, I'm asking you to predict here, which you don't have to do if you're not comfortable, but like, do you think that we're at the place where Netanyahu would kind of go ahead with that invasion, even if Biden unequivocally said, don't do it? And if you do, that's the end of our help for you.
I Well, we could go off of what we've seen. I mean, obviously, it's at least from the outside, it seems like they've been talking about this invasion for weeks, if not months, at this point, right? And they've put it
Yeah.
off for various reasons. Um, what we have seen is Biden. If I remember right, he said there was a red line, but he also said he would never stop supporting Israel or something like that, or he would never stop supplying the Iron Dome. So it was sort of like kind of a pale red line, like it was sort of a red line, but he was never really like, we will cut off arms to Israel if they do this, or we will, our relationship will fundamentally change. It's just like, or there was that line in his it may have been the State of the Union, we can't have 30,000 dead Palestinians. Well, it's like you already have 30,000 dead Palestinians, and your policy has not changed, right? So I think looking at that pattern of sort of these rhetorical flourishes, but not any real change in policy, it doesn't seem like there's any reason for Netanyahu to doubt that that would continue to be the case. Now, when it comes to what is happening behind closed doors, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a international affairs reporter. But I do think we have seen a pattern of like um, warnings and condemnations from the Biden administration, and not really any sort of change in rhetoric or planning from the Netanyahu government. So it when or how this invasion happens, who can say? but it does not seem like the Biden administration has successfully altered the course of this war in any way. Um, there was a article on Israeli missile targeting. This is in 972 magazine that we wrote about in HuffPost. Basically, an AI targeting program, and it was a great article talking about just the massive civilian casualties that resulted from this, not only in the use of AI to narrow targets, but also in the extremely high um, uh, casualty rate that the Israeli military was willing to accept, on the off chance even that they would hit a low level Hamas soldier or operative. But one interesting point in that article was that the first sort of month of the war was extremely deadly, and then it sort of tapered off a little bit. I think in the first 100 days, something like 24,000 people were killed, and that's combatants and civilians. And in the second 100 days, which just occurred a few days ago, maybe an additional 10,000 people were killed. So still a ton of people, but the pace of the war changed a little bit in its latter weeks. What that says about Rafah, I can't say. There are a lot of people smarter than I am when it comes to military strategy and diplomacy. But just from the outside and from the domestic politics perspective, on the first point is it doesn't seem like Biden is really willing to lay down a red line with Netanyahu. And the second point is it doesn't seem like Netanyahu perceives any sort of red line because he hasn't substantially changed his policy toward Gaza.
I mean, and to some degree, it makes sense, right? Because by all accounts, Netanyahu's time and power seems pretty intimately tied to how long the
Mm-hmm.
war continues, right? So his kind of self-serving motives push in the direction of dragging it out or escalating it or
Totally.
somehow kind of keeping it going, right?
Yeah, I guess so. He's part of a wartime government with the opposition parties in Israel, and so the thinking goes: as soon as this war ends, so does his political career, and perhaps so does his time outside of prison, depending on how various corruption charges go. Yeah, that's if I were in his position, that would be something that would weigh on my decision making, also for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just I don't even know how to fully articulate this, but it's like, Biden is primarily a politician, right? Primarily a politician who wants to be reelected in a few months. And it's like, this is an issue that is, I think, genuinely difficult from a political side for a Democratic leader. Like there's, as you mentioned earlier, a pretty stark generational divide. I think he is of the generation that feels really strongly about defending Israel and Israel's right to self-protection and everything. But you just kind of brought this to the surface of my brain about how there have been rhetorical flourishes, as you put it, but not huge policy shifts. And so it does seem that he's trying to, in a small, slight way, kind of like make the language reflective of the concerns of the younger people, particularly the younger people in the Democratic coalition, while kind of keeping on the track that the often the older members kind of support and want him to keep on. I mean, and there's no way to know this, but I just wonder, do you think that's more of like his personal convictions thing, or is that something more calculated in terms of, we know that young people tend to be low turnout voters, right? That from kind of a calculated perspective, it's more important to keep the older people on your side, come November.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I mean, and there's also a question of like whose first issue is this war, right? Like,
Mhm.
and like you said, who's more willing to come out and vote? Generally, older people rather than younger people, and also the younger people that care about Israel and Gaza as a first issue. How likely are they to vote? A lot of these folks may not be voting anyway. I don't want to, talk down to anybody who doesn't believe in the electoral system, but just you know uh, that may, yeah, maybe he sees the people that are organizing against this war are people that wouldn't be enthusiastic about voting for him in the first place. Certainly true. Um, but also, I don't doubt for a second that he feels strongly about Israel and about America's commitment to Israel. I'm Jewish. My parents are Jewish. Their parents are Jewish. Speaking to my grandfather when he was alive about Zionism and about Israel, it was a visceral issue for folks in our grandparents' generation who liberated concentration camps. Zionism was not some theory. It was the answer to a genocide, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
how it was pitched to the world, and that's how it was pitched to Jews also. Um, and you know, uh, that's I don't even really know how to talk about it outside of that context, because that's such a powerful history, and that's such a powerful part of the state of Israel and of America's relationship to Israel. I think the trends that we see in young people, including young Jews, when it comes to their relationship with Israel is no small part because we don't remember the Holocaust, obviously, right? Um, so and certainly Joe Biden, I think, fits into that generation who knows the Holocaust and who knows Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. I think our generation is one that knows Palestinian American college students, right? And we've heard that other side of the story that for a long time has not been part of the mainstream conversation when it comes to Israel and the Palestinian territories. Like the whole effort of the past 20, 30 years of attempting to diversify college admissions, attempting to include more voices in our public discussion, part of that has meant making room for people who are refugees, who are Muslim American, who are Arab American, who are stateless people. And so they are part of our American political conversation in a way that they simply weren't when Joe Biden was coming up as a young person and as a politician. So I have no doubt that there are sincerely held beliefs on his part that just make it a lot more difficult for him to see young people's perspectives on this. Um, I'm not sure if we're at a point yet where he sees the electoral danger in this war. And maybe the folks that do see the electoral danger of pursuing Israel, of supporting Israel's military policy, maybe they're wrong. Maybe it's not going to be an important election issue. Maybe it's just something, a moral issue, a conscientious issue. Excuse me, for people who care about this. And maybe Biden is right to think that he will be reelected without grappling with the implications of our policy with regard to Gaza. So I think it can be both, but I don't see him, at least for now, changing his position in reaction to these protests.
That's really well put. Just to kind of wrap up here, you started a new Substack gathering string about this to cover it, kind of on top of the coverage that you're doing for your day job. You know, why is it so important for you to kind of cover and write about this so much?
Uh, well, so part of it is I just don't like making money for Elon Musk. I want to post. I want to post less on Twitter. I also like talking to people who I know want to talk to me about this stuff. When you publish stuff on the internet for your day job, you get all sorts of people responding to you. When you do something on a personal website, it's people who you know generally, or people who seek out your writing. And if someone's listening to this who has a serious disagreement with how I've characterized any of these news events, please check out that website and message me about what your thoughts are. So yeah, I just think it's a way to um, try to be introspective and try to reflect a little bit about how I'm doing my job. Obviously, the way we've talked about this issue and this war today, it's like a really complicated topic with a lot of political divides that aren't really traditional American political divides, right? So I think it's a really complicated story that I've had a really hard time wrapping my head around. And so I think every chance I've had to sort of explore it deeper, I've tried to pursue that. But, so that blog it's about that right now, but it's kind of just a space for me to talk about work outside of work. So yeah, please, don't worry about subscribing or anything, but if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the way I do my job, I would love to hear from you listeners who are listening to this.
All right. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on today. It's been a really great conversation, and it was so nice to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Yeah, this was a lot of fun, and it was so cool talking to you about this, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. We'll have to have you back. Belaboring the Point with Kate Riga is a TPM podcast. The show is hosted by me, reporter Kate Riga. The show is produced by the excellent Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to our good friend, Why Not Jansveld, for our podcast theme song. And thanks to our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review the show on Apple Podcast and subscribe wherever you listen.